Findaz, Keepaz by McNeill. The Orca war heaved to, the ragged cloth of its tar-cloth sails billowing in the swirling thermals of battle, its battered metal prow cut through the smoke, and its broadside cannons thundered as it crushed heaps of blazing wreckage beneath its spiked roller wheels. The debris scattered through the crater floor was still glowing cherry red from its fiery descent through the atmosphere, and choking banks of burning petrochemicals coated every breath. Bloodface Ed Basher spun the battle wagon's wheel, hauling the clanking, rumbling behemoth into a skidding left turn. He bellowed with laughter as the whirling blades mounted on the front grille noisily sliced these new orcs on the block to bite-sized chunks of green meat. Orca war had once been a piece of agricultural machinery, but Redgun Razung's mechs had up-armored it and weaponized it into a death wagon of fiendishly killy power. Now it boasted a bladed prow of harvester threshers, long claw arms to drop victims into a hopper of crushing, pulping machinery, and a host of skull-stamped crow's nest turrets with more dakka than you could shake a pointy stick at. The deck shuddered beneath him as something exploded in the gubbins, and a plume of tar-black smoke pumped from the engines. They were still going, so it couldn't have been anything important. He held the battle wagon at full speed, roaring around the vast oval crater blasted in the landscape by the falling orbital remains of something meant to stay in space. The Ox was strewn with metal, debris, and all sorts of shiny booty Captain Redgun had ordered him to salvage before Scarblitz's boys got wind of it. Trouble was, some of the big bad warlord's boys had roared into the crater not long after Bloodface and his boys had begun loading the trucks to take back to Redgun Bay. Seeing the red of their war trucks, bikes, and battle wagons, Bloodface knew he'd have to fight them, which was fine and dandy by him. "How many of them do you think are here?" he asked. "Lots," said Pugwaz. His Gretchen spotter stood against the mast beside Bloodface. A pair of crooked bronze telescopes jutted from his skull. Doc Zoganek had bolted them on and fastened a pair of looking goggles onto the back of the Gretchen's head. "I can see that," snapped Bloodface. "Use them eyes of yours." Pugwaz craned his scrawny neck, trying to see all around him, which wasn't easy, since nailed to was probably a better description of his relationship to the mast than stood against. But when bullets started flying, the runty little fella tended to run off if Bloodface hadn't kept him stuck in place. "Lots and lots," said Pugwaz. "That's better," said Bloodface. You could look through the goggles stitched to the back of Pugwaz's head and see stuff that was dead far away, even if it did look a bit wet and blurry through the little fella's skull meat.
"Don't look like there's even interested in the loot," said Pugwaz. "Looks like they just want to race."
Bloodface nodded. He'd seen that most of the new orc vehicles were red. They roared around at insane speeds, smashing into the freebooters and each other, shooting, ramming at random and exploding. Loaded vehicles were on fire or smashed to junk, and orc corpses littered the ground, cooking in the heat from the rocks. Whoever won this fight, and it was hard to tell who that might be in the swirling morass of vehicles, would have plenty of hot food at the end of it. "Evil sons," he grunted, watching a bright red buggy flip over onto its side and skid to the bottom of the crater, where it plunged into a smoking split in the rock. "Speed freaks, a lot of them." But he was enjoying the screeching, slamming mess of vehicles. Freebooters were swinging on ropes from truck to truck, curved swords clenched between their teeth. Sometimes they even landed on the enemy ones.
"There she blows!"
shouted Pugwaz. Bloodface looked to where the Gretchen was pointing his head and grinned. A squadron of buggies was on fire behind them, careening madly out of control after a lucky hit from Nazgrag's quarterdeck's battery of shooters. They exploded, hurling green-skinned bodies through the air on fire. Shells blasted through the burning bodies, the orcs still firing with their last breath. Nazgrag's boys were busy bashing their heads together in celebration. The knob himself stood on the timber railings, waving his hook hand in glee, like he thought he was some sort of hero. Bloodface took a pot shot at him with his blaster, and Nazgrag ducked back as the fiery shell zoomed past his head. "Getting too big for his boots, that one," said Bloodface.
Who's that?
"Who'd you think?" snapped Bloodface. "Nazgrag. Gonna have to keep a close eye on that one."
Aye, Captain,
said Pugwaz. "I ain't captain," said Bloodface, remembering the crumpin he'd gotten from Toothbreaker just before their ship crashed onto this world. The skinny gits they'd first captured called this place Archangels, and so far the orcs hadn't had much of a fight. But then Scarblitz had arrived on a big fiery rock, thinking he was all big and clever just because he landed, more or less, in one piece. The big red rock they called their big fort, like it was some fancy Umi castle or something. Bloodface had only seen it once, when they'd ran the Orc War past it to see how big and how red it actually was. Really big, and very red was the answer. A truck bashed into the side of Orc of War, and Bloodface forgot about strategy things and grinned as he spun the wheel again. Against Orc of War, the truck didn't stand a chance, and it exploded like someone had planted a bomb underneath it. Maybe they had. That sort of thing sometimes went on in scraps like this. Orc bodies tumbled through the air, laughing and yelling. Gunfire blazed past Bloodface as a few of the flying orcs slammed down on the deck like they'd intended that all along. A boarding action, Speed Freak style. "Stand by to repel boarders," he shouted. A dozen orcs with red and yellow bandanas wrapped around their heads nodded and stood watching the dazed boarders pick themselves up. "What you doing?" yelled Bloodface, when none of them charged in and got to killing.
You said stand by,
said Pugwaz.
That's what they're doing.
Bloodface slapped a palm against his face.
Well, stop standing by and stomp 'em!
Breakneck Wazcrash slapped out the fires burning on his legs and pushed himself upright. That he was alive came as a welcome surprise, as was the fact he didn't have a load of swords sticking out of him. For some reason, the dirty, stinking freebooters were just standing around watching him and the lads who'd made it over from the truck. He'd make them pay for that mistake. A big orc at the wheel shouted at them, and they ran at him shouting things that made no sense. Avast and scurvy and something about timbers shivering. Unlike Breakneck, who wore proper armour, these boys wore stupidly bright clothes, stripy trousers and waistcoats of red, brown and blue. Some of them even had funny hats instead of metal on their heads. A couple fired pistols that made a lot of smoke and noise, which was pretty shooty, but the bullets bounced from the thick plates of metal Breakneck had strapped on. He roared and threw himself into their midst, hacking with a vast cleaver with a motor strapped to the blade. Tearing teeth chewed through green flesh, and he bellowed with laughter as his opponents came apart. The deck became a mad, whirling free-for-all of blades and booming shooters. Breakneck fought whooping orcs along planks cantilevered out from the gunwales. Up knotted nets of rigging and swung from one end of the thundering battle wagon to the other on burning ropes. It was a strange kind of battle wagon, more like something that should be on the water. Breakneck didn't hold with things that floated. Wasn't natural. Metal things on water sank. And any orc that thought this was a good look for a battle wagon, a vehicle that only ought to go land in Breakneck's experience, needed a good head stomping. Though this had been a good scrap, the crater was a great place to get some proper speed up, even if they could only turn left, but Scarblitz wasn't far behind. If Breakneck wanted to keep breathing, he'd have to kill these freebooters quickly. He landed on the deck in front of an orc wearing a baggy white shirt made from war banners. Black and yellow striped trousers were tucked into brown leather stomping boots with steel reinforcement. A crimson bandana covered his skull and one eye was hidden behind a black iron patch. Gold rings and barbed hooks pierced its lip and tooth-torn ears.
Pretty boy, ain't ya? Said Breakneck.
Prettier than you'll ever be again, grunted the freebooter. They held themselves at one another, fighting without thought for defense, only attack, hacking, clawing and brawling like skull-bashed pit fighters. Breakneck had to admit, this orc was pretty handy with his cleaver chopper. Most of his riveted armour was lying in carved chunks around his feet, but he'd landed some good whacks with his own blade, and the two of them were bleeding heavily.
"What they call you?"
said Breakneck, as they broke apart on the sagging bowsprit of the battle wagon, the breath heaving in their chests like rusted exhausts.
"Bloodface Ed Basher," said the orc.
"One of Redgun's boys."
"Yeah, what's it to you?"
"Nothing,"
said Breakneck.
"Just wanted to know, so I could tell Scarblets who you was."
"Scarblets ain't here."
Breakneck pointed his notched and buckled cleaver over Bloodface's shoulder.
"Yeah, he is."
Bloodface saw the two orcs standing in the path of the wildly careening battle wagon. One was a hunched wretch of an orc, carrying a bronze staff and surrounded by a crackling green haze. Beside him stood a towering brute, the living, breathing embodiment of Gork. Or was it Mork? Himself. But, standing where they were, neither would be living or breathing for much longer. Wheezing, groaning struts of mega armor surrounded the warlord's colossal form. But even that wouldn't be enough to save him from being crushed to red paste beneath the Orc of War's wheels. Bloodface's opponent turned and leapt from the battle wagon with a wild yell, leaving him alone on the bowsprit. He roared and lifted his cleaver chopper high. He yelled as a booming flare of green light erupted from the smaller of the pair, and the Orc of War slammed headlong into it. Its tapered prow crumpled as though it had run into a cliff face. Momentum carried it onwards, the behemoth of steel and fire and gears and timbers flattening itself in a thunder of buckling metal against the crackling, orky power. The battle wagon's rear end flipped up into the air, twisting in midair as though enormous hands were wringing it like a Humie's neck.
"Sog me,"
said Bloodface as he was catapulted into the air. The blazing wreckage described a perfect arc over the two orcs, before crashing down and flattening itself in a heap of smouldering wreckage. Bloodface tried to open one eye, realized it was the one covered by the eye patch, and tried again. The other eye was gummed shut by blood and oil, but it opened anyway, pulled open by rough fingers.
"Would you credit it?"
said a voice with a grunt of amazement.
"You was right, boss. He's still alive."
All Bloodface could see was a grainy, blood-filled smear of light and smoke, and the end of a dirty finger holding his eyelid open. He was lying on his back, that much he could tell. The last thing he remembered was the Orc of War ramming the Weird Boy and the Warlord. And things got strange. Instead of squashing them, they'd somehow broken the battle wagon. Rough hands pulled him upright, and he found himself face to face with the two orcs that should be dead. Behind them, the wreckage of the Orc of War lay strewn in a trail of buckled, unrecognizable metal. The Weird Boy cackled with a lopsided grin, his eyes dancing with green fire, and the bristles of hair on his head standing upright on his tattoo and glyph-covered skull.
"Told you I could do it,"
the Weird Boy said to the hulking brute of a warlord. Straight away, Bloodface knew there was only one orc who'd be willing to trust the word of a Weird Boy and stand in the path of a battle wagon.
"Scarblets,"
he said. The warlord leaned down, his armor clanking with the movement and venting a stinking burst of fumes. Cogs and gears squealed and pistons growled as the huge claws on his arms snapped open and shut. A necklace of fangs and teeth hung around his neck, some still wet with the saliva of the mouths they'd been ripped from. Scarblets was the biggest orc Bloodface had ever seen. Bigger than Grim Lug Toothbreaker. Bigger even than Red Gun Resgang. Almost as big as a Killer Khan.
"You're one of Redgun's lads, ain't ya?"
said Scarblets. Bloodface thrusted out his tusked jaw.
"Yeah, what about it?"
Scarblets hooked him under the jaw with his claw, lifting him into the air. His booted feet hung 2 meters off the ground.
"This is my world, innit?"
said the warlord with a steel-fanged grin.
"Redgun made a deal with me, and it'd be a shame if I had to kill him, wouldn't it?"
Bloodface tried to shrug, which wasn't easy when he was hooked like a fish.
"Redgun knows he made a deal, Scarblets,"
said Bloodface. and he ain't about to try and cheat you.
I think he's lying to you, said the weird boy. I smells it off his thoughts, as sure as the stink of the drops.
Scarblets grinned, exposing yet more of his metal-sheened fangs.
Is Guzzagag right? You lying to me, freebooter?
Bloodface considered lying again until he looked into the weird boy's sizzling green eyes. That psychic fire crawled inside his skull, peeling back layers of what little cunning he possessed with a cruelty that went way beyond anything he'd ever known a weird boy to possess. To lie was to die.
Well, is you lying?
Said Scarblets.
Little bit, yeah,
admitted Bloodface. Scarblets swept a powerful arm around the crater, a crater that was now being picked over by his lads.
So you was planning to keep all this booty for Redgun, eh?
Bloodface tried to nod, but only ended up working the warlord's claw deeper into his jawbone.
Yeah, find his keepers and all that,
said Bloodface.
Oh, it won't happen again. Mork's on her.
Scarblets dropped him to the ground, and Bloodface landed in a numb heap before the towering warlord.
Yeah, right, it ain't gonna happen again,
said Scarblets, leaning down.
You go back to that cheating heap of squig droppings and tell him that if I think he's holding out on me again, then I's gonna come down on them ruins you call home and crump 'em so flat there won't be nothing left worth a single tooth. You get me?
This time Bloodface did not.
You can't send him back like this,
said Guzzagag with a manic gleam in his burning green eyes.
How's that?
Said Scarblets.
You send him back in one piece. Redgun's gonna think you's gone soft.
Bloodface shook his head.
No. I'll tell Redgun that you're pure dead hard. The toughest, meanest orc that ever lived.
Yeah, but how's he gonna know that?
Said Guzzagun.
Guzzagun's got a point,
nodded Scarblets.
You gots to go back with a good wound, so Redgun knows you at least put up a bit of a fight. Otherwise, he'll think you just gave up, right?
Right, agreed Bloodface before realizing what Scarblets meant. Before he could protest, Scarblets leaned down and severed Bloodface's right arm at the elbow with a blindingly swift flick of his power claw. He howled in pain, staring at the blood jetting from his arm. It hurt. Gawk, it hurt. But not as much as it probably ought to. At least he could finally get that whirling hookblade gubbins Doc Zoggenzek kept wanting to bolt onto him. He clamped a hand over the bloody stump.
Yeah,
he said.
I gets ya.